Hello, Professor Dupont. It's great to see you again. Could you please introduce yourself for us?
Yes, it's great to see you as well. And I'm Carolyn Dupont, and I'm a professor of history at Eastern Kentucky University in Richmond, Kentucky. And my research focuses on religion and race. And particularly, I've looked at Mississippi and the way that white religious folks, primarily evangelicals, responded to the civil rights movement really after 1945. I've recently turned to some other interests, but for a long time, that's been the focus of my research. And how about you, Brandon?
So I'm Brandon Paradise. I'm a professor of law at Rutgers in Newark, New Jersey. I primarily work at the intersection of Christianity, race, and law. A lot of my work has centered on the cultural implications for the law of the Black religious tradition and its intersections with more contemporary forms of social justice. Recently, I've also done a bit of work in the area of liberal political theory and its overlap with various strands of the Christian tradition. So
I think this is going to be a great conversation because there's so many peripheral ways that our work intersects.
absolutely. I'm really excited about this conversation today. So if we could maybe get started with theology. We often, right, try to think about the Southern religious experience in the Jim Crow era as one that might be described as a form of cultural captivity. Can you comment on that and whether you think that is an appropriate way to think about the relationship between religion and culture?
Let's start by talking about what the cultural captivity thesis was or is. It was an argument advanced by Samuel Hill in the 1960s. Churches in Cultural Captivity was the name of the book in which he advanced this thesis. And the idea was that there's a core of Christianity that is not racist, that believes in racial equality. The racial equality is part of the core of true Christianity. And the problem for Southern churches in this thesis is that they are captive to a white supremacist culture. And so in this thesis, it's almost as if the white supremacist culture has got its tentacles in the church and is preventing the church from being its true self. And I argue against that thesis because I think that to understand Christianity, white Christianity, religion, the church, as separate from the culture and therefore even being able to be held captive by it, just really doesn't understand what religion is, because religion is possibly one of the most determinative aspects of culture. Religion is culture. It's one of the most vivid expressions of culture. So how can it be captive to itself? To pretend that there's kind of this core Christianity that doesn't have anything to say about race, or only all that it says about race is racial equality, to pretend that that's the case is just not accurate. And so I think we have to center the ways that religion is always shaped by culture, and is indeed is part of the culture, if we're going to get an accurate understanding of this. And if I could, just to take the long view and to talk about a little background before we get to the Jim Crow era. We can't pretend that there's a religion that emerges all of a sudden in 1895 or whenever we want to technically start the Jim Crow era. And we have to think about the ways that religion and race have interacted over the long view of American history. And I don't want to get bogged down in moments before the Jim Crow era, but I'd like to just hit on a few really quickly that I think are important for us to understand. And the first one that comes to mind is if we just go back to the 15th century and think about the era of colonization. And there was something called the Doctrine of Discovery, which was a papal bull. And of course, 15th century, we really don't have much Protestant Christianity at the time. But the Doctrine of Discovery was a papal bull that essentially authorized the Christian king of Portugal, in this case, to subdue, to make war upon, to colonize, to appropriate from all pagan peoples. And this was most directly applied to African peoples in Africa, but it certainly got extended to the settlement and colonization of the United States. So right there, there is a conception of race that is embodied in the dominant form of Christianity. And, you know, there's a lot we could say that happens in the intervening period, but then if I could just fast forward us to the antebellum period, when the South was defending race-based chattel slavery, they did so on a religious basis, that God had ordained a hierarchy of races, and that it was all in God's plan, that people of African heritage were really at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And, you know, I could refer us to a famous speech given by James Henry Hammond in the US Senate in 1858, you know, which is known as the Mudsill speech, that essentially the darker races were the mudsill of human civilization, meaning that they were the labor force upon which everything else rested. And it's no accident that the three largest faith traditions, Protestant faith traditions in the United States, split into Southern and Northern expressions in the 15 years before the Civil War. So the religious communions split first the Methodist Church in 1844, then the Baptist Church in 1845. In fact, this is the origins of the Southern Baptist Convention. And it was in each case over slavery. In the notion of the South was, if you say that we can't send missionaries abroad who are slaveholders, well, then you are implicitly saying there's something morally inferior about our way of life as slaveholders. And we can't accept that. We can't remain in fellowship with you. And so I think that those are important things for us to understand before we even get to the era of Jim Crow. And I'll just close out what I'm saying here by reminding listeners or saying, if people don't already know, that Southern pulpits defended the Confederacy. They were not neutral in any way, shape, or form during the Civil War, and they were defending the Confederacy because it wanted to preserve its rights to hold slaves. And when the war was over, they didn't repent or change their minds about that position. They didn't say that slaveholding, oh, gee, we were wrong about that theologically. No, they didn't. They said that we were always right about it, but God was punishing us for other moral failings, and that's why we lost the war. So that's really the sort of theological background out of which we get the Jim Crow era.
So if I could sort of hone in on how that theological background relates to this thesis that you've rejected, which I think is so important, because if I understand the cultural captivity thesis accurately, it's the claim that there was a Jim Crow culture, a white supremacist culture, that the church was held captive by.
Yeah.
But the church nonetheless was in some respect kind of held apart from.
Well, I think, you know, it was advanced by people like the great historian Samuel Hill, you know, who was a person of faith and believed that Christianity demanded racial equality. And so in that conception, there is a core, a non-racist, shall we say, core of Christianity that is essential to the faith. And what I'm arguing is that for most of our history, that's really never been true. And that the culture and religion kind of mutually define one another.
Now, that's so important to understand, because I think it shows the way, as you've said, that the two are mutually constitutive.
Yeah.
Religion and culture are cooperating together in a project
yes,
that has large sort of tentacles in every
Yes.
aspect of American life, and that shapes racial subordination and hierarchies of conceptual understandings of race. As we
Yes. And I want to ask you to talk more about that, but I want to just say one more thing. You know, it's not as if the church had to be dragged along in a bad business, which is what I think the cultural captivity suggestion would imply. I think that, you know, it's this notion that the culture was racist and, oh, we had to drag the church along to cooperate. And that's just not true. The church was a full partner in creating a race-based hierarchy.
Now, could you talk a little bit about the ways in which commitments around individualism
Mm,
help to kind of, in some ways, free individual Christians from
yeah.
moral responsibility
Yes.
or white supremacy?
Yeah. I mean, this is so important. And we see this really developing in the antebellum period as Southern people of faith were defending slavery as a Christian form of social organization. And in fact, as the most Christian form of social organization. And what they essentially said was that Christian faith is really an individual project. It's about the individual believer and their relationship to God. And therefore, the church, and I'm using that word really to mean the expression of believers in the world. Um, and this is a very white conception, and we will talk about how that wars against Black conceptions of Christianity, but that there's really no social responsibility because Christianity isn't concerned about the condition of this world. And Christianity is only concerned with the individual heart and the individual soul. And therefore, yes, we will preach to enslaved people and convert enslaved people, but their condition of enslavement is not altered by their Christian faith. And we as Christians have no obligation to change that. And so it's a very individualistic form of Christianity that emerges in the South and that becomes really important as we get into the Jim Crow era. And I'll say more about that as we go on. But I think that understanding Christianity as an individual and not social project is really important, even though it's enacted all the time in social ways and in cultural ways. The understanding of it is that it's private and individual.
Right. And it's my understanding that in the period in which Southern Christianity is emerging, developing this kind of ideological apparatus that sort of shields individuals from responsibility for social evils and
Mhm.
otherwise would think of as quite obvious kind of breaches of ordinary obligations to other human beings. There was in the background this theology of premillennialism, which essentially said that, well, the big overriding concern for Christians is the arrival of this millennial age where Christ will reign. The key for all Christians is to be in right relationship with God as an individual.
Yeah.
So that when this imminent kind of return of Christ occurs, one is in good standing. And that doctrine, as I understand it, essentially said, we don't have to worry too much
Mhm.
about surrounding social injustices because the overriding concern is preparation for the imminent return of
Yeah.
Jesus.
Yes. And, you know, that's a doctrine that gets kind of policed. You know, orthodoxy, which we can think of orthodoxy as right belief. And so Southern white expressions of Christianity are constantly policing the orthodoxy of people in the church and reminding them to focus on individual salvation, reminding them to focus on their soul's condition and the condition of other people's souls. And as soon as any preacher, because it did happen from time to time, a preacher would get in the pulpit and talk about social concerns. Well, you know, that's liberal theology and that's Northern theology. And, that is not the conservative theology that we here in the South espouse. And going along with that, there was a big critique of the social gospel, and the social gospel being understood as any understanding of Christianity that suggested life could be improved in the here and now. And that's actually, understood as a doctrinal heresy to many to evangelical Christians. Now, evangelical is a very broad term, and it's not to be confused with fundamentalism, but very often in much of the South, they are one and the same.
Well, it's so helpful that you made this point about competing interpretations of Christian faith, because that's existed from time immemorial, going all the way back to the very earliest church. So you had abolitionists, both in the North and some, of course, across the Atlantic. And I'm sure as well you had some abolitionist commitments even in the South, but you would have been so heavily policed by the surrounding culture that I'm not sure how much we really would have heard from those folks.
You would leave is what you would do.
You would leave, right, if you had those commitments, because you would not be able to articulate them freely. But this in some ways reminds us of the ways in which theology reinforced the legal apparatus of Jim Crow. Because conservative forms of religious faith that emphasize individual responsibility and also arrange people into racial hierarchies so that God doesn't want intermixture of people, and God's created people, to live separately. And so you had this competing sort of view. I mean, the slaves oppressed pictured themselves as, and I'm sure this is captured in earlier sessions, as the Hebrews enslaved in Egypt, and that social sort of sensibility continues sort of consistently within the Black church up through the period that we're focused on here in Jim Crow. And of course, even after today, we have wonderful examples of this in the form of William Barber. So we have this very alive Black social gospel, but alongside that is this white conservative kind of interpretation of the faith that I would add. The individualism is, I don't want to only identify with Christianity, it's also tied to other things. So you have, along with the emergence of this radically individualist form of faith, of course, these Enlightenment ideals that really sort of focus on sort of the individual as the primary unit of moral concern. And we also, of course, are working within the shadow of a Reformation in which individual professions of faith, individual conscience becomes really key. And I don't want to, of course, conflate forms of Christianity that developed in the South, these kind of lower church forms with the higher forms of liturgical structures and so forth that existed in England. But there nonetheless seems to be this complicated kind of historical sort of collection, assemblage almost of ideas that, for worse, for Black Americans, sort of come together to kind of arrange social life so that the individual is paramount. And of course, along with that, we have forms of pseudoscience, social Darwinism, as interpreted. I mean, to be blunt, by people who were just committed to rationalizing white supremacy. And those things kind of neatly kind of happen to coincide with these racialized interpretations of Christian faith.
I think a great example of this, just for a specific example of the ways that understandings of Christianity were spiritualized by white Christians, but understood differently by Black Christians, is the story of the Exodus. And in white churches, that is understood as spiritual. That is the spiritual exodus out of a life of sin. And it has absolutely no application to anything in the here and now. And I would argue that it's still taught this way today. But for Black Christians, especially in the era of slavery, it was a literal exodus from bondage. And so that's just a really, I think, wonderful example of how the same biblical incident, fundamental to the longer tradition of Christianity, is differently interpreted and understood by Black and white Christians.
That's a nice transition to what you earlier inquired about, which is the way that the law
Yeah.
helped to kind of reinforce segregation in this area. And more
Mhm.
especially, I guess it would be useful to talk about how the law of religious liberty functions in the era of Jim Crow. And I think it's useful, I guess, to sort of tie that to the social gospel, because along with this very oppressive, racialized set of concepts and legal structures that worked to always force Black people to the bottom in ways that were both brutalizing and in ways that had severe, concrete, daily implications for Black life. There was this pocket, you would say, of African American freedom, and I don't want to accent that too much because I'm going to talk later about how the law also failed to uphold the promise of freedom in the form of religious liberty that allowed the Black church to come into existence. And so we are widely, I think, familiar in our day with this notion of the Black church, and that, of course, is a much more complicated concept than just the Black church alone conveys. But it begins in part as a response to segregation, which
Yeah.
then leads Black folks to form their own independent churches. Up until the 1960s, the federal constitution would not have been applicable to states so that Black religious liberty would not have been protected by the federal government as such. Now, I bring that up at this stage because it's a complex, I think, interplay here. You have an overwhelmingly racist culture that works to subordinate Black people at every step along the way. And as a result of that subordination and segregation, Black folks form their own church.
Yeah.
And then that becomes a basis for a space in which Black agency and autonomy can exist, even while federal law is not there to uphold it. For most of Black history, the federal government was in no way a defender of Black religious liberty, and yet Black folks, through resilience, strength, often, I think, risking quite a lot, developed a social gospel that challenges white supremacy in an era where there was no federal court to appeal to. So then that causes us to wonder, well, how was that religious liberty carried out at a time when the federal government wasn't there to protect Black folks? And they were in states, especially in the South, but this was all around the country, really, a lack of true equality. States which were very focused on oppressing Black folks. And just briefly, I would say, state constitutions often protected religious liberty without regard to race, but the concrete daily lived realities of what it meant to be Black in a Southern state and to practice a religion of one's choosing was very different than what the books, right, would suggest. So, and you could easily, I think, supplement much of what I'm now going to say with your expert historical knowledge of the period. But my understanding is that through much of this period, leading up to Jim Crow, there were organized forms of sort of white control of Black religious speech. We know that in Baltimore in 1911, there was even a law that officially mandated that churches were to be segregated. And so this was, a direct way in which the law sort of structures religious liberty and structures Black forms of spiritual life in ways that reflect broader racialized conceptions of how people ought to live. It also had vast impacts on white clergy because the Catholic Church and the Episcopalian Church in Maryland, in Baltimore, were ones that were committed broadly, I understand it, to racially integrated services. And so those white clergy also risked prosecution if they were to run afoul of the mandate of segregation. And so we sort of look at, the law generally as protecting religious freedom on the books. And then when we delve a little bit more deeply into that, we find, well, the federal courts couldn't protect it, right? And the state courts didn't do much to protect it at all, although there were some state courts in the era of Jim Crow that would implicitly kind of follow the federal standard, which I'll talk about that now.
Mhm.
And while it was not formally incorporated, that did happen at times. But now the federal standard, though not applicable to the states, essentially said that religious liberty was protected by the Constitution under the First Amendment's religious freedom clause, free exercise clause, unless there was an overriding public interest
Mm.
that conflicted with the religious liberty, right, that a person laid claim to, or that a church laid claim to. Well, that standard, which came out of an 1878 case called Reynolds, was not, as I say, applicable directly to the state, so some followed it. But for Black folks, the idea that an overriding social interest could override religious liberty would have been incredibly damaging to
Mhm.
the vision of faith that defines the social gospel and define people like Martin Luther King who wish to resist white supremacy. And that's because for many states, the public interest was exactly in the maintenance of Jim Crow.
Yeah.
It was
Yeah.
exactly in the maintenance of white supremacy.
Mhm.
So the
Or
public
understood that way.
were
Yes.
understood that way.
Yeah.
So the public
Yeah.
interest as a means of overriding religious liberty hadn't even, come before courts. And it at times, and we'll talk about this later, at times there were litigants, as we'll see in a case called Perez in 1948, which tried to, bring challenges which were successful on other grounds than religious liberty. People say, well, this is segregation, anti-miscegenation, it's restricting religious freedom. And the courts were not really embracing of that claim. Instead, they tended to resolve racial equality claims through the Equal Protection Clause and not through the First Amendment. So I want to now talk a little bit about the cultural forms of religious commitments that undergirded white supremacy, particularly as it relates to anti-miscegenation statutes.
Mm.
I think you could probably share quite a bit with us about how anxieties over interracial sex was a big engine and driver segregation in the Jim Crow South, and of course also rationalized by Christian theology.
Yeah. Religious discourse around sex in general is very pervasive. That really, in many ways, the sort of idea is, individual salvation, no drinking, and no sex outside of marriage. These are the first two sins in the catalog of sins. And the restrictions around sex, of course, it's preached one way and practiced another, understood one way and practiced another. So we know that there was interracial sex happening all the time, and it happens with impunity when the man is white and the woman is Black. If it ever happens the other way, it's punished severely. And I think, one case to think about is the Willie McGee case. So there had been a sexual and romantic liaison between Willie McGee and a white woman, and it was consensual, at least by all indications. But yet the court ruled that Willie McGee would have to be executed, and the case wended its way through a series of appeals. It was a state case, but he was finally executed in public in a portable electric chair that was brought outside the county courthouse. And I believe it's the county courthouse in Laurel, Mississippi. And again, I may have the exact Mississippi community, but I believe it is Laurel, to a crowd of white people that is surrounded and cheer this man's execution. And yet we know that there are liaisons between white men and Black women that go unpunished all the time, because the whole discourse is that Black people are insatiably sexual and that they want nothing more than sex with whites. And that has to be policed. Now, in the broader discourse, any kind of sex outside marriage is policed, but it definitely has, it's sex outside of marriage is always regarded as evil in these traditions, but if it's a mixed race sex, then it's especially evil. And so that would rank really, really high in the catalog of sins that are policed, and it certainly has implications in the law. So that, I think that's a very good example of that discourse around sex and the religious discourse around sex.
It's a great example, and it also illustrates, or at least it's a segue to how anti-miscegenation laws and the various kind of like forms of justification restricted the ability to love people,
Yeah.
which is obviously tied, right, to Christian ideals of marriage.
Yes.
Bring up some very, I think, obvious contradictions. So people ought to marry someone that they freely and voluntarily consent to. I think this is tied up with not all Christian traditions require vows, but it's generally understood even where there aren't vows. And of course, that it's obvious the marriage is voluntary. People are choosing to marry someone who they wish to dedicate their lives to. And yet, anti-miscegenation laws prevented people from acting on what for many Christians is a sacramental religious, right?
Yes.
Covenant of marriage, right? And so quickly to this case that I mentioned earlier, Perez versus Leopold, people will be surprised if they're not students of the area that it comes out of California. Right? This is the case brought in decided in 1948, where you have a white woman and a black man who wish to be married in a Catholic church, and the state refuses to issue them a marriage license.
Yeah.
They bring the claim in part on the grounds that the denial of the right to marry constitutes a violation of their free exercise rights. California court upholds their right to marry, but it does so on equal protection grounds, do it on religious liberty grounds. And interestingly, there is a dissent in the case which denies that there's a religious liberty claim there on the grounds that, well, the Catholic Church permits the marriage, but doesn't require the marriage. Right? And then the dissent goes into all of the kinds of rationales that we are well familiar with regarding the harms of interracial, marriage in terms of both the contamination of the white race, eugenics, concerns around social tensions that would be introduced by this couple, what would happen to the children, right?
Yeah.
Or a product of this marriage. And so it really, I think, brings into focus a lot of the anxieties that supported in a positive sense, not just kind of in a defensive kind of sense that, we wish to kind of just avoid social kind of sanction as white Christians, and instead brings into relief the various ways in which science and theology kind of come together to deny people the right to marry someone of their choice. And of course, that's not because the court is acknowledging that, but because the broader cultural content, right,
Yes,
has basically said, well, the races ought to be separated. In fact, in Loving versus Virginia, right, the trial court said there that Almighty God created the races separate. I'm paraphrasing this, but Almighty God created the races separate, and they ought to remain that way. They ought to remain separate, right? And of course, that is itself just quite an ahistorical claim in the sense that there's always been travel and there's always been commerce among different parts of the world. I mean, people have always kind of intermingled, and it's not the case that people have been walled off. I mean, as we know, like race is socially constructed. There aren't pure races anyway, but the way this is understood and interpreted reflects these broader preoccupations of the Christian church that readily embraced these forms of science, which as I began to sort of make brief reference to earlier, kind of arise with this kind of like modern sort of enlightenment idea. We're going to sort of do things scientifically, empirically, and we're going to try to figure out what the best way to arrange life is, and that leads into very pernicious ideologies like social Darwinism. Now, could I ask you, what, in your view, is sort of the role, I guess, of the church in the period, in if there was a role in attempting in the South to, if there, I mean, this is kind of a reach because I don't know if there was a role, but was there any pocket that's identifiable of people saying, well, look, you know, rights from a religious Christian point of view ought to be, accorded,
Yeah.
equally. Are you aware whether that was even available in the South at all, other than the Black church?
So, yes, I think we need to understand that the boundaries between church and state in many Southern states were just highly blurred. And particularly in a state like Mississippi, we know that, for example, prohibition in Mississippi far extended the timeline of national prohibition. So national prohibition is from about 1918 to the early 1930s, but Mississippi began it actually in the late 19th century and extended it well into the 1960s. And that's a function of the religious culture. Another good example of the ways that church and state are very much bound together. And again, my expertise is really in Mississippi, so I refer to that, but I've found many of the same things to be present in other Southern states. But as a specific example, when the Scopes trial, in the wake of this 1925 Scopes trial, many states passed laws that demanded the teaching of evolution in schools. Mississippi did the opposite. And Mississippi, the state legislature passed a law forbidding the teaching of evolution in public schools. And so, at least as in terms of what was on the books, it was against state law to teach evolution in public schools until 1971.
Mm-hmm.
So, these are ways in which the boundaries between church and state are very much blurred. And many Mississippians don't have a problem with this. And so if we want to, push the public school example even a little further, it'd be very common to have prayer and Bible reading in public schools. It would be very common maybe for especially a country school that, is next to a country church, and you just file out of school and into church and have a chapel service. And so there's a lot of real blurring of these lines. And that extends forward into the Jim Crow era. I want to connect this to your question about were there people who argued in the South who argued for equality of rights, and particularly on a religious basis. And I want to say that, absolutely there were. But what we're talking about here is sort of the dominant culture and the voices that were heard. And I'll start with the Methodist tradition, which was the second largest faith tradition in many Southern states, the largest faith tradition in the country. But that church reunited in 1939. And so the value of a national denomination as opposed to a regional one is really immense, because what it means is that the theological currents are circulating throughout all branches of the church. And so after 1939, Southern Methodists are reading the same Sunday school literature and the same religious literature as a Methodist in a place like New York or Ohio. And what this means is that when a critique of segregation comes from the church, they hear it in the South, and especially if it's a faith-based religious critique of segregation. And many Southerners object, and so this becomes a war over the meaning of Christianity, a fight over the meaning of Christianity. And you alluded to this earlier, but I think this is a thread we want to bring forward. So Southern Methodists, are often saying, gee, our church is becoming heretical. They're embracing a social gospel, and we want to preserve that good Southern conservative expression of Christianity that we've always known. But there are others who hear that critique of segregation and say, there's something here.
Right.
And so there is a fracturing of Christianity that happens in the South. And here I'm talking about white Christians. Um, but it's not an even split. So the voices saying the national church is wrong are more numerous. The voices in the South, they're more numerous. We can see the same thing in the Southern Baptist tradition, even though the Southern Baptist tradition, just a reminder, we said this earlier, it comes out of the fight over slavery. Southern Baptists have never reunited with their Northern counterparts, even still till today. So it's a religion with roots in the South, and if I may say, with theological roots in the defense of slavery. The Southern Baptists become, they put their tentacles into the rest of the nation. So they become a national religious denomination while retaining their Southern roots and flavor. But the same thing really happens to them that's happening in the Northern, in the Methodist Church. That there become some voices that start to advance a critique of segregation from a faith-based perspective. And these become people at the seminaries and at the denominational headquarters. And, I think it's so interesting, the story you get depending on who you look at. So very often, if you're looking denominationally, in 1954, when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was announced, the Southern Baptist Convention happened to be meeting in St. Louis within a week of that decision being announced. And so there's this just wonderful moment that I've relived in my mind in which the messengers, what we would call delegates, but they understand them as messengers to the Southern Baptist Convention, representing Baptist congregations all over the country, stand up and affirm the rightness of the Brown versus Board of Education decision that declares segregation in public schools unconstitutional. And, they affirm that decision in a voice vote, and they follow it with this great Baptist hymn of surrender, where he leads me, I will follow. And so many people have looked at that and said, well, Southern Baptists, which, by the way, to be Southern Baptist in 1954 was by definition to be white. There were no Black congregations in the Southern Baptist Convention. And what happens is that there's a tiny, tiny dissent of about 100 people out of thousands that is based largely in Southern congregations. And they go back to their churches and say, whoa, 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 whoa. We didn't affirm that decision. And we think it's wrong. And we're not unchristian because we prefer segregation. And so there develops this great tension, not great in the form that it's good, but great in a significant tension between these Southern congregations and their national leaders over this issue. And those are, there are pockets that agree with the national church. But what often happens in Mississippi is just by saying, as a pastor, maybe a white Methodist pastor, a white Baptist pastor, gee, I agree with our denomination. As segregation becomes threatened, that could get you removed from your church.
Or maybe even worse, potentially, right? I mean,
yes.
I think what you're kind of underscoring in a sense is that though there were these pockets, the overwhelming, leadership of Southern churches and the people in the pews took forms of Christianity that encoded as morally correct, supremacy and Jim Crow just for granted.
Yes.
There's this blurring of church and state that, though it sort of occurs at a time when there are some objectors, nonetheless, for all practical purposes, those objections, if I understand the error correctly, had little force or even little impact on Southern sort of legal culture. And I know you're not talking about the law, but in terms of it wasn't as though these religious dissenters from Southern Jim Crow Christianity would have had much hope at that time of overturning Jim Crow.
No. And, there's an exodus of people. And here I'm thinking particularly of ministers who spoke out. There's an exodus from Mississippi of some of those white religious leaders who dared to critique Jim Crow in any form.
It's safe, I think, to conclude, I think many people are widely aware of this, that segregation isn't just a mandate from the law, it's a religious obligation, but also it is a pervasive form of social organization.
Yeah.
You would find virtually everywhere, in Southern life. I remember
Yes.
visiting the Alabama Civil Rights Institute years ago, and just looking through the museum and seeing how laws were in the books. You couldn't play cards with someone of another race. You couldn't play a ball game. I mean, it was pervasive, so it could be taken for granted that
Yeah.
segregation was the norm. And so, as I think about that, it sort of brings to mind the ways in which civic organizations and local life kind of encode norms of Jim Crow and norms of racial hierarchy from the law. So the law is one very significant source of structuring both religious life in directions that are racially separate. But it's not the only source, because you have the churches playing this role, and that, of course, has immense impact on Black religious liberty. One surprising example to many people who may not study this area, specifically, is the ways in which the YMCA's,
Yeah.
is it the Young Men's Christian Association,
Yes,
right?
it is. Yes.
Segregated, even though
Yes.
one of their primary goals was the teaching of the Bible and the sort of organizing prayers and instilling Christian values and so forth, but South segregated. And it wasn't until 1946 that the National YMCA says we're going to pass a resolution to ban segregation. It's not until 67 that the YMCA actually bans it. So as a result of that, Black folks developed their own Black YMCA's.
Yeah.
Which I think are just another illustration. So in the early period, back to like the late, 18th century, we have the founding of the Independent Black Church. And as a result of other later forms of segregation, we end up getting Black civic organizations like the Black, Y, which are organized, of course, around this commitment of sort of instilling Christian values. But in that sense, like Black folks are sort of, compelled to start parallel organizations
Yes.
that allow them to lead out their moral and religious lives, apart from white the broader white society. And of course that is tied obviously to things like social clubs, which were also highly discriminatory and also religiously inclusive.
And I think it's interesting too. It's always understood by white people as preference, but it's
That's a way of life, right? I mean,
yeah.
right.
But it's also, well, black people prefer to worship differently. But what you're saying underscores the fact that really they're compelled to do this because they're not given equal treatment or even allowed to participate in these other organizations.
We can still see this huge kind of contrast between the numbers of Black Christians who were willing to engage the social gospel tradition and take it up and champion it, in comparison to what we're seeing among the Southern white Christian churches.
Yes, and if I could expand on that just a little bit. So I think tension within Black churches is really the operative thing here. There were times, now this is not always the case, but there were times that the white power structure would kind of control local Black congregations through the minister. So, if you don't preach this civil rights stuff, if you behave, we'll support your church. We'll maybe see to it that you have some equipment. Maybe we'll give you our cast off pews. Maybe we'll actually contribute to you financially. But in the bargain is that you're going to keep quiet about civil rights. So that did happen sometimes. But the other thing that happens is that whether or not Black churches were the locus of civil rights activity, white Mississippians often understood that they were. And that is why in the summer of 1964, there's absolutely an orgy of burning of Black churches, because the belief is that they're all hotbeds of civil rights activity. And this is the way of punishing them and reminding them, that that's not what you're allowed to do.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's also an example of how like white private actors, right, were constraining, restricting Black religious freedom, because a lot of Black ministers, talking about like King, Abernathy,
Yes.
Ed Shuttlesworth, they're out there leading these civil rights movements, not only as an expression of secular kind of, ethics, but as an expression of a Christian vision of how life ought to be lived, right?
Yes.
So many Black ministers are threatened. Some are actually killed, by George Lee, who led voter registration campaigns, assassinated in 1955, right? That's just one example. So there are examples of white supremacists enforcing white supremacy against Black leadership.
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting too to think about the different sectors of white society, and how they respond to this very ugly violence. So who's committing the violence? Well, it's not the better elements of white society. It's not the deacons at First Baptist Church in downtown Jackson. It's not the elders at First Presbyterian. But what's interesting is that they are all part of this broader theology that allows that. Now, there is a very interesting response to the burning of Black churches among white Mississippi Christians. So, and this comes actually from the Mississippi Baptist Convention, the White Baptist Convention. They actually undertake a fundraising drive to rebuild those Black churches. But what's interesting is they're utterly quiet about the ideology that enabled the burning of the Black churches. So what they're objecting to is violence in the defense of white supremacy, not white supremacy itself. And if I could, Brandon, maybe this is a good place to bring in the church visit campaign, because I think all of these little incidents show how religion is absolutely integral, and that segregation, religion is absolutely integral to maintaining segregation. That same year, 1964, and actually this had begun the previous year, one of the things that Black activists initiated was a church visit campaign. And it's actually Medgar Evers is part of this. And of course, he's assassinated fairly quickly after they begin this. But with a white minister named Ed King, who was one of those voices of dissent in the white South. And they begin to visit white uptown congregations, in particular in Jackson, a few other Mississippi towns. They do it in other parts of the South as well, but Jackson really becomes the epicenter of this. And they present themselves for admission. And they choose the best dressed among them, the most respectable, and they just come to the door of the church wanting to worship on Sunday morning. And if you can believe it, they're turned away. And there's a famous incident on Easter Sunday when one of the Black bishops of the Methodist Church, Dr. Charles Golden, presents himself with a white bishop of the Methodist Church at Galloway Memorial Methodist Church in downtown Jackson, which is really, we would call it the flagship church of Mississippi Methodists. And so here is a white Methodist church turning away a bishop of their own denomination. But what also happens in many of those cases is that the local police are waiting there to arrest these protesters. All they did was ask to come to church, and yet the police are involved, and they arrest these worshipers for disturbance of the peace and take them to jail. And that's a really brilliant, it ends up being a really brilliant strategy, I think, on the part of Black activists, because what it does is to expose the religious underpinnings of white supremacy and to expose what's the ideology that's making this whole thing possible. But what it also does is missionaries of these traditions who are working in places like Africa or Indonesia or India, where there are darker skinned people, the people in those countries read on the front page of their newspapers that Galloway Memorial Methodist Church, our First Baptist Church in Jackson, has turned away Black people from worship in a common faith. And these missionaries write back to these white Christians and say, what are you doing to us? How can we possibly suggest to these people in Ghana or whatever country we may be ministering in that, you know, we're bringing to you a gospel of hope and a gospel of equality when you are demonstrating every Sunday that you don't believe that. And so these missionaries put pressure on the church to break down this white religious ideology.
Well, these forms of contradiction, I think, are really powerfully illustrated in a group like the Ku Klux Klan itself.
Yes.
It's both a champion of religious liberty and also, of course, one of the primary sources of Black church bombings and burnings.
Yes.
And killings and assassinations and so forth. So this is like deeply embedded, as I understand it, within kind of the Southern fabric of life, in the sense that people just kind of understood, even if they were not Klans men and men themselves, they kind of understood that, well, religious liberty means one thing for us, and it means something very different for Black folks. And I think we see this particularly in how religious liberty norms were applied to non-Christian Black groups, like the Nation of Islam, in here of the Moorish Science Temple, even Father Divine, who's not sort of an ethno-religious group, but he doesn't lead a group like that. He leads a group in favor of interracial, religious life, because they're not classically kind of, Christian groups. I think it becomes very apparent how the broader culture doesn't really accept religious liberty in its kind of like full kind of, like a articulation, magnitude, register. It just doesn't accept it. I mean, if you fall away from our particular and structured way, religious life, whether that's what you're preaching in a Christian church or whether what you're doing in a non-Christian, form of religion, we will discipline you. We will find ways to sort of, prosecute you for disturbance of the peace, which certainly happened to, Father Divine. And we'll also find ways to label your religious practice as really non-religious, something that's there to really challenge. So I think one of the key threads in the story of Martin Luther King's ministry is that he was labeled a communist.
Yes.
By many people, right? So this wasn't bona fide Christianity, right? This form of the social gospel was really a cover for, a secular communism, right? I mean, this was so religious liberty is then kind of like, stripped away from people insofar as it's not the exercise of religion as King and others understood it was not endowed by the broader culture with sort of a legitimate form of religious practice. Just wasn't understood that way. It was understood as something, right, very different.
You're absolutely right. And even, the discourse around communism is completely tied to religion because, communism is considered the opposite equivalent, not of capitalism, but of Christianity. And so there is a discourse that's really nationwide around communism at this time. And I think it's important to think about the fact that the 1950s was this time of a flowering of American Christianity when church membership soars to all-time highs. And so these are all connected in many ways.
Right. They're deeply connected. And it's also, I think, an illustration of the ways in which, despite this massive resistance to Black forms of social gospel and other forms of religious life that sought to kind of, address white supremacy, there's this incredible kind of perseverance, resilience, courage. I mean, King at one point says that the level of violence against the Black church was only previously seen in the early church and the catacombs that
Yeah,
right,
that's stunning.
overwhelming levels of violence.
I think we maybe should wrap up by talking about the legacy of Jim Crow today,
Right.
and to reflect on how the religious culture of that era, how does it continue, how does it impact religion and law today? And I'm happy to start with that question. One of the interesting things that has happened in recent years is that for many evangelicals, and I really do want to be careful about not making sweeping statements about evangelicals, because that tradition is a varied tradition. And there are many within that tradition that do advocate for social justice, but there remains a very individualistic strand within American evangelicalism. And the theology is exactly the same. That it's individualistic, that the core of the tradition is one's own private relationship with God. And evangelicalism can be very selective about which social concerns it's willing to take on. And typically, it doesn't do a very good job of addressing systems or even understanding systems. It really can, it's almost like a computer that can only read certain kinds of software, and the only software it's really good at reading is individual shortcomings, individual sin. So what has happened in many evangelical circles, and again, not all, is that racism is just added to the catalog of sins. And so you can't be a racist if you're a true Christian. But there's no attempt, and in fact, there's sometimes even a rejection of any effort to look at the systemic ways that race might still be a factor for many Americans. That they want to put all of the struggle in the past. It all ended, and maybe that in their conception, it all ended in 1968, when in that framing of the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King died and the whole thing was over, which of course, if we had time, I would challenge that chronology very, very heavily. But, it's in the past. And so it doesn't do a very good job of understanding the ways that we still have systemic racism. And, I think a great example is the fact that in South Carolina, they will no longer be offering the AP African American History course. And that's not germane anywhere more than in South Carolina, because historically South Carolina was the colony and then the state that had the highest percentage of Black Americans in its population. Some counties, 9 African American residents to every 1 white person. And so, South Carolina of all states ought to be offering not just AP African American history, but ought to be offering African American history, because that is South Carolina history. There is no understanding of South Carolina history that doesn't include people of African descent. And so, in my view, that's a systemic understanding. So I think that is one way of thinking about the legacy of Jim Crow. I think that in many pockets in American life, white religion is still understands itself theologically as, it doesn't understand itself this way, but it is theologically the religion developed under slavery. And let me just give you one example of that. A revered figure in the Presbyterian Church in America, which broke off in about 1983 from the Southern Presbyterian Church, because the Southern Presbyterian Church was had reunited with the Northern Presbyterian Church. It broke off, preserving the more conservative theology, and sort of their paragon of this theology is Robert Louis Dabney, who was nothing if not a staunch defender of slavery, of race-based slavery, and of the Confederacy. And so, that his theology, and of course, the way it's explained is, well, we don't believe he was wrong about the racial stuff, but he's right about everything else. And I would argue that you really can't separate them, that they develop part and parcel. And I would also add that that's a tradition that also doesn't believe in women's equality. Now, they have ways of talking around it, but when it comes right down to it, women are not allowed to be elders and preachers in that tradition and are expected to be subordinate to their husbands. So I think the legacy is still with us in many forms.
Well, so I concur entirely. The legacy is with us theologically. It's also with us experientially. The American church still remains de facto segregated. In many parts of the country, churches are overwhelmingly disproportionately white, with very few Black members. Even in recent years, we've had some churches openly denounce like interracial marriage. There are still pockets of that kind of open and very very, very obvious form of Jim Crow style Christianity, but certainly the inheritance of Jim Crow Christianity lives on in the tendency to think about the Christian life in primarily individual terms that have no social implications. And this isn't only a matter of ordinary kind of perceptions that we have of American life. It's also been studied by people like Michael Emerson in his book, Faith, right, which empirically kind of goes through ways in which white evangelicals have belief structures that free them from, or not free them, I was going to say.
No, I think that is the word.
free them from responsibility. Because right, anything that's awry is reflective of individual relationships, something wrong with individual relationship, not something wrong, right, with the way that our broader life has been arranged both today and as it was handed down in a very big from the past. Like James Baldwin has this wonderful phrase, the past is always with us, and that couldn't be more true. Right, in this context. So we have these forms of religious commitment that really, if you want to, just be really candid about it, are not well grounded historically. If you were looking at, say, the first 1,000 years of the church, I mean, if you were looking at like early forms of Christianity, certainly wide kind of social remit, wide responsibility, right, for other people, and then just to kind of like add to that, I think the forms of theology and social experience that define the contemporary, white evangelical church are seen not just in the professions of how people are saved and the lived kind of reality of who goes to church with who. But frankly, also picked up in very explicit political alignments and configurations. You have people kind of lined up with certain kind of political positions. So, it wouldn't be a good thing, for example, to have forms of social support that provide relief to people. And that's in part because historically, relief to large numbers of people was disproportionately perceived to benefit Black folks.
Right.
And that's a complicated story. I mean, we don't have time to go through exactly how those two things are related, but there surely is a relationship between kind of resistance to broader social welfare programs and individualized conceptions of Christianity that are built upon kind of this foundation of white supremacy, but just complete abdication of any kind of responsibility.
Yeah.
I mean, there's this sense, right, that we have at this particular moment, maybe over the last like 5 years or so, a real resistance, explicit resistance to
Yeah. Yeah.
the history of white supremacy and
Yeah.
brutalization that
Yeah.
slave African Americans endured through Jim Crow. We see that, as you've already talked about, in curricular changes that wish to kind of remove, African American history. We see this
Yeah.
in forms of pushback against, critical race theory.
Yeah.
This is really bound up with, um,
Yeah.
bound up with kind of an avoidance of knowledge about what
Yes.
happened. So this isn't
Yes.
about condemnation, although in some cases it's appropriate to say, right, that things, right, are morally wrong and they should
Yeah.
not. And among those things is surely like, Jim Crow and the other things we've talked about in this session and the other sessions we'll talk about. But more important than even just the condemnation, as far as like where it's necessary, is, as you say, I think, just an understanding of how where we are today is not the result of a free-floating, historical vacuum where we are in history, but we're not in the past.
Yeah.
Right? But in fact, many of the problems that continue to sort of challenge us and beset us are
Yes.
rooted in very concrete commitments that we haven't really fully come to terms with.
Yeah. I think I love the way you said that. That's it, only by coming to terms with it can we really transcend it.
As we kind of look to what we can do now, educating folks about this history and even giving them a better sense of what has religious liberty meant for different people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? It's a key task, moving forward.
Yes, it is. And so in closing, let me just ask you a question that all speakers in this curriculum are going to be addressing, and that is, what is your hope for religious liberty?
I think it's critically important that broader numbers of people outside of legal scholars, outside of historians, come to have a deep understanding of how religious liberty has been shaped by race and how religious liberty has been reconfigured over the course of American history to supply different communities with different levels of religious freedom. And then closely tied to that is a broader kind of task that in some regards spills beyond the confines of this particular session, which is I think there needs to be a greater understanding of what religious freedom has been,
Yeah.
right, and historically in the United States, because we have a very, I think, challenging discussion between contestants over religious liberty.
Yes, we do.
Very few people really have, delved into what religious liberty historically meant in the country, how it's changed, and why it's changed in some respects. So I think there's a lot of education to do, both with regard to the particular experience that Black folks have endured and how white forms of religious life have operated to reinforce segregation, to reinforce Jim Crow and racial inequality, but also this other question of, what religious liberty is just more broadly. It's
Yes.
not understood. So I have the hope that people would gain greater knowledge in both those areas.
Boy, I will just second everything you said and add one thing. I think that religious liberty is actually the foundation of many other liberties. It's the foundation of freedom of thought, which is the foundation of freedom of speech. And so I think that there's a lot of room for educating around what religious liberty is and what it has meant and the complications involved in it. And I too would hope for a richer, fuller, more historically grounded conversation at large about that. So,
well, we're in agreement.
yes. Well, Gosh, it's been just really wonderful to talk with you about all of these issues and to explore the many dimensions. And I've just enjoyed the conversation so much, and I thank you for it.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it as well, and very lucky to be able to share this time with you.
Thank you.